Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. We will now proceed to Afar 18. Please get ready with your handouts. Our topic is factory overhead allocation and allocation of support department cost. And we now proceed to the methods of assigning cost to cost object. We take up first the three methods of assigning cost to cost object. If cost can be traced physically to the cost object, particularly, more specifically, products, because we are dealing with product costing in our cost accounting. If cost can be traced physically, then we assign the cost by direct or physical tracing. And that is the case of direct materials. The direct materials that form an integral portion of the product can be physically traced or can be directly traced to the cost object. So that is simply assigned by direct tracing or physical tracing. Now, if it can't be traced physically or directly, the activity or the driver can be traced. The activity or the driver that drives the incurrence of the cost for that particular cost object, pwede natin gamitin yon sa pag-assign ng cost. Like in the case of machine operators' wages. There's no question the salaries and wages of the machine operator. That's actually direct labor. But of course, we cannot trace physically the labor in the physical output or of the cost object. But we can conveniently trace the activity, which is actually the machine time, the number of machine hours, to the output or to the cost object. So sa kasong yon ay pwede nating i-assign yung cost by driver tracing. For other costs which cannot be traced or which cannot be assigned by physical tracing or by driver tracing, we do the arbitrary method and we call that allocation. Ito pong allocation, that is the process of assigning cost. In particular, indirect cost to the cost object. Yun pong cost na hindi mo matritrace by physical or by driver tracing, ina-allocate yon sa cost object. Sa three elements of manufacturing cost, ladies and gentlemen, yung direct materials at direct labor, mga direct cost ng products yun eh. So, madali pong i-trace yon, madaling i-assign yon. But in the case of factory overhead, which is an indirect manufacturing cost, ang pag-assign niyan, allocation. So strictly speaking, if we talk about allocation, we refer to assigning factory overhead to the products or to cost object. Allocation is the process of assigning indirect manufacturing cost or indirect cost sa ating cost object. So, ang ating iti-take up, ladies and gentlemen, ay allocation of factory overhead. Ulitin natin ha. Tatlo ang paraan sa pag-assign ng cost sa cost object. Direct or physical tracing, driver tracing, and in the case of factory overhead, which is an indirect manufacturing cost, we assign that through allocation. And so we have factory overhead allocation na pinag-aralan ninyo sa inyong undergraduate, sa review, tinitake up natin. Of course, there will be allocation ng materials, allocation ng labor. In the case of joint and byproduct costing. But that is allocation in the sense na it's a common cost. Generally speaking, pag sinabing allocation naman common cost at indirect cost ang ibig sabihin niya. But in this particular topic na materials, labor, and overhead, we are relating it to the products na cost object. Yung allocation tinutukoy natin dito, ladies and gentlemen, is yung allocation ng factory overhead. Okay? So, paano natin i-allocate yung factory overhead? Okay, so, meron tayong traditional methods, and then we have activity-based costing. Under traditional or conventional allocation of factory overhead, we have the plant-wide or blanket overhead rate system. We have the departmentalized system. And then, yung isa, ABC, activity-based costing. So, traditional, dalawa. Yun po ay plant-wide system at departmentalized system. And then, activity-based costing. Between the two systems, traditional and activity-based costing, of course, yung activity-based costing, that is more accurate. But in our past number 2, wala pa naman yung activity-based costing na mababasa kayo, no? In fact, yung dun sa ating past number 2, we allocate factory overhead using the normal capacity. Or we have the other cost measurement technique like standard costing, but there's no mention of the activity-based costing. But of course, for decision-making purposes and for internal purposes, the activity-based costing can be applied. And this is a system as to which method will be applied. That is a matter of cost-benefit analysis. Okay? So, ang ating iti-take up po ay plant-wide, departmentalized system, and then activity-based costing. We illustrate the plant-wide system, the departmentalized system, and then the activity-based costing. So, ang pag-uusapan natin, ladies and gentlemen, ay factory overhead. Ang factory overhead ay indirect manufacturing cost. Tandaan ninyo yan. At yan ay ina-assign natin through allocation. And then, we have 3 valuation system or cost accounting system. We have the actual costing, we have the normal costing, and then we have the standard costing. Yung actual costing, the actual factory overhead, yun ang tinatransfer natin or ina-apply natin sa work in process. Sa normal costing, there is a predetermined factory overhead rate. At ang ina-assign natin, ina-charge natin sa work in process is the applied factory overhead, which is based on the predetermined rate. Multiply yon sa actual capacity attained, yon ang applied factory overhead that will be charged to the work in process. And then we have another costing, yung standard costing, wherein materials, labor, and overhead ay puro mga predetermined, puro mga scientifically predetermined, which we call standard or standard cost. And the applied overhead there is different sa normal costing. Yung normal costing kasi, overhead rate times actual capacity attained, But in the case of standard costing, the applied factory overhead is the overhead rate. More particularly, we call that standard overhead rate times the standard capacity allowed on actual production. Standard capacity allowed on actual production. More on that, ladies and gentlemen, pagdating natin sa Afar 20, yung topic na standard costing. Okay? And please be familiar with the routine entries that we are supposed to record in accounting for factory overhead. Incurrence, recording actual factory overhead, to apply overhead, then to close over or under applied factory overhead, either by closing it to cost of goods sold or by allocating it to finished goods, work in process, and the cost of goods sold. As to which method, that will depend on the significance or materiality of the over or under applied factory overhead. But the default method there is the cost of goods sold. So whenever the problem does not specify as to which method will be applied or will be used in disposing the over or under applied factory overhead, you are going to close it to cost of goods sold. Okay? We illustrate problem number 1 for the under or over applied overhead, and then the allocation or disposition using the two methods. Gibson uses a predetermined overhead rate of 5 per machine hour to apply overhead. During the year, 32,500 machine hours were worked. Actual overhead costs for the year was 187,500. And here are the records. Materials inventory, end of the year, 22,500. Work in process, finished goods, and cost of goods sold. These are the balances, of course, before the disposition of the over or under applied factory overhead. The requirement is to determine the amount of under applied or over applied factory overhead. How do we compute for that? It's very simple, ladies and gentlemen. You will compare the actual factory overhead sa ating applied factory overhead. At ang applied factory overhead, ito po ay normal costing, actual capacity attained times the overhead rate. So the actual overhead is 187,500 and our applied factory overhead is 162,500. Excuse me. The actual machine hours ay 32,500 at yung predetermined rate ay 5. So 32,500 times 5, that's the applied overhead, which is 162,500. Yan po yung debit to work in process, credit to applied factory overhead. Yan pong 162,500. Samantala, yung actual na 187,500, yan po yung ina-accumulate natin sa factory overhead control. Debit to factory overhead control, and then the various credits or various accounts. Depende kung anong nature ng overhead na na-incur. Okay? So, under-applied po yan, 25,000. Pag ang difference niyan ay positive amount, under-applied. Pag negative amount, over-applied yan. Ngayon, paano ang disposition yan? Ulitin ko, pag significant yung amount, yan po ay i-allocate. Sa letter B, assuming allocation method, o di i-allocate natin yan. Let's allocate that. Using the balances, i-allocate sa finished goods, work in process, at saka cost of goods sold. The balances before the disposition of the over or under applied overhead ay mga sumusunod. 37,500, 50,000, and then 112,500. So, i-allocate natin yung 25,000 under-applied factory overhead, 37,550, and 112,500. Our common denominator is 200,000. So, the fraction of the work in process is 37,500 over 200,000, or that is 18.75%. Then for finished goods, that's 25%, 50 over 200. And then for cost of goods sold, 56.25%. That is 112,500 over 200. And then multiply nyo po yan sa ating under-applied factory overhead na 25,000, and here is the allocated amount. For work in process, 4,687.5, 6,250 finished goods, and 14,062.5 for our cost of goods sold. And because this is under applied factory overhead, you're going to debit cost of goods sold. So, that is an increased adjustment. Kaya, ang magiging balance ng ating work in process, finished goods, and cost of goods sold after the allocation, ito po, 42,187.50 for work in process, 56,250 for finished goods, and then 126,562.5 for our cost of goods sold. Alam yung nangyayari kapag allocation method, ibinabalik natin sa actual. Kasi syempre, pinag-compare mong actual at applied. Antimano, yung applied yun ang nasa work in process. Karaka-raka, nung dinispose mo yung over or under applied, inallocate mo pabalik sa kanila. O din naging actual uli. Well, that is the reality. We are reverting it back to actual because the amount is significant or material. It will misstate the financial statements if we do not do that. You know, materiality has been so pervasive in preparing financial statements. Kaya kung material yung effect, ayun, ibabalik natin. Ginawa nating actual uli. Kasi mamimisstate ang mga inventories, ladies and gentlemen. Yun ang reason dyan kung bakit kailangang ibalik sa actual kung material or significant yung amount. Ito po ang magiging entry. Debit applied factory overhead, debit work in process, finished goods, cost of goods sold. Para dun sa share nila sa kwan, under applied. And then close the factory overhead control, 187,500. Now, assuming that the under applied overhead is immaterial for letter D. Pag immaterial yan, ladies and gentlemen, you simply closed it to cost of goods sold. So, the cost of goods sold will be 112,500 plus 25,000. It will be 137,500. And the entry will be debit to applied factory overhead, 162,500. Debit cost of goods sold, 25,000. Credit factory overhead control. Kino-close sa cost of goods sold kung immaterial, ha? Or insignificant. Anyway, immaterial naman. Hindi mamimisstate ang inventories. Pero kung material or significant, ayun, kailangan nating i-prorate. But if the amount is insignificant or immaterial, i-close nyo lang sa cost of goods sold. Cost of goods sold lang maapektuhan. Okay? I hope that is clear. Hindi naman mahirap yan, ladies and gentlemen. Yang under or over applied, tapos yung disposition. Chicken feed nyo dapat yan. Hindi yan mahirap. Next, we proceed to problem number 2. We will illustrate the computation of factory overhead rate. Ang formula sa pag-compute ng predetermined overhead rate, ladies and gentlemen, ay estimated factory overhead or budgeted factory overhead divided by the estimated capacity or estimated denominator activity. Ganun lang kasimple. For example, here in Kramer Company, if overhead is based on DLRs, based on DL cost, and based on the machine hours, ang ating overhead rate, predetermined rate ay ito po. Based on direct labor hours, we have 3.75 or 375 per DLR. That is very simple. Estimated overhead, 150,000 divided by 40,000 DLRs, 375 per DLR. So you have to express your overhead rate in terms of monetary, in terms of money. Kapag ang denominator ninyo ay non-monetary, ang overhead rate monetary. Pero kapag ang denominator ninyo ay monetary or financial amount, syempre numerator financial yun monetary yun kasi overhead yun Percentage naman ang tamang pag-express. For example, in number 2, DL cost, 150,000 divided by 200,000, that's 75% of DL cost. 75% ng DL cost. Okay? And based on machine hours, 250 per machine hour. 2 pesos and 50 centavos per machine hour. Okay? Now, for letter B, assume that the actual overhead was 152,500 and that Kramer elected to apply factory overhead to work in process based on DLRs. Actual DL was 42,000. Was the overhead over-applied or under-applied and by how much? Computin po natin. Actual factory overhead, 152,500. Applied factory overhead is 42,000 times 375. That's 157,500. Then that is over-applied by 5,000. And if we close that to cost of goods sold, debit applied factory overhead, 157,500. Credit factory overhead control, 152,500. And credit to cost of goods sold. Kapag over-applied, bawasan yung ating cost of goods sold. Pag under-applied, dadagdag sa cost of goods sold. Okay? So, this is letter C. Letter C requirement. The entry, Applied factory overhead, debit, credit factory overhead control, then credit cost of goods sold. Ayan. So, you are now refreshed on the simple procedures sa pag-compute ng overhead rate, pag-compute ng over or under-applied, and then yung disposition. Ngayon, dumako na tayo doon sa 3 methods na pinag-usapan natin kanina, yung plant-wide system, departmentalized system, and then activity-based costing. Unahin natin to, problem number 3, and this is departmentalized system, tapos plant-wide, and then activity-based costing. So, we will illustrate the 3. Tatlong cost pool yan Sa plant-wide system, ladies and gentlemen, the cost pool is the entire plant, manufacturing plant. Ang pooling ng cost, yung plant, manufacturing plant. Ibig sabihin nun, i-accumulate mo lang, ipupul mo lang yung overhead sa manufacturing plant na yan, tapos divide sa allocation base. Yun ang overhead rate. Pero pagdating sa departmentalized system, ang ating cost pool, yung department, in particular, producing department. Ang ibig sabihin nun, ang accumulation ng overhead or pooling ng overhead per department. Kasi kanina buong company, isang planta eh. Kasi hodang napakaraming departments dyan sa isang kumpanya, sa isang planta, ang accumulation naman natin per plant eh. Hindi napakasimple. Kailan yan pwedeng gamitin? Kung ang product mo ay isa, kahit maraming departments yan, kung iisa lang naman ang klase ng product mo, plant-wide talaga yan. Eventually kasi lahat ng overhead, siya rin ang mag-a-absorb yan eh. Now, if you are producing more than one product, and then the products consume different resources in every department, the plant-wide system will not be a good system to allocate factory overhead. In that case, as far as traditional method is concerned, mas okay na gamitan mo ng departmentalized system. Okay, illustrate natin yung departmentalized system at saka plant-wide. So, mapapansin ninyo, ladies and gentlemen, dalawa ang department dyan. Assembly department and then packaging department. And narito po yung budget. VLRs, there are two products, deluxe product and then regular product. Yan. And then ito po yung total overhead cost. The total overhead cost is 720,000. 720,000. Compute predetermined overhead rate for each department if assembly uses labor hours and packaging uses machine hours. So, ito po yung ating factory overhead rate. Ito po ay departmentalized system. Sa departmentalized system, kung gaano karami yung producing department, ganun karami yung ating overhead rate. Ang ibig kong sabihin, bawat producing department may separate na overhead rate. As the products go through to that department, the products will be charged with overhead based on that predetermined overhead rate in that department. So sa assembly, based on VLR, 216,000 divided by 160,000 VLRs. Yung total overhead sa assembly, ito po. Yung total overhead in assembly department, ito, 216,000. At ang total VLRs, 160. Kaya yun po yung ating overhead rate. 216,000 over 160,000 VLRs. Then for packaging, which is based on machine hours, 504,000 divided by 80,000 machine hours. So that's 6.3 per machine hour. 6.3 per machine hour. So meron na tayong overhead rate. Next requirement is calculate the per unit cost for each product if departmental overhead rates are used. We calculate the per unit cost. Pag per unit, kumpleto na yan. Materials, labor, and overhead. We compute, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so the prime costs are the following. For deluxe, 160,000. For regular, 1,500,000. Given yan, class, ha? Ito po yan, no? 160, 1,000,005. Next, we compute the factory overhead. In assembly department, ang overhead rate doon, 1.35. Based on DLRs. Ang DLRs ng Deluxe ay 10,000 at regular 150,000. Ito po yan. Ayan, oh. Okay, sa assembly tayo, ha. Deluxe, 10. Regular, 150. So, 10,000 times 135, 150,000 times 135, that is 13,500. And 202,500. Okay? Now, for packaging department, it's based on machine hours. Yung number of machine hours po, ay ito po. Sa packaging tayo, ha? 8,000 kay Deluxe. Regular naman, 72,000. So, i-multiply nyo yon sa overhead rate, which is 6.3. 8,000 times 6.3, that's 50,400. 72,000 times 6.3, hindi yan 3.3, ano? 6.3. That's 453,600. So, ang total factory overhead allocated to Deluxe ay ito po. Halimbawa, tanungin, yan pong 13,500 from assembly department and then from packaging department, 50,400 or a total of 63,900. Okay? Total overhead allocated to regular, ito po, 202,500 from assembly and 453,600 from packaging, and the total is 656,100. Yan pong factory overhead, i-add natin sa prime cost. Ang total manufacturing cost po ay ito. Then divided by the units produced, here is the per unit cost of the products. 11.2 or 11.20 and then 10.78. Yan po ang departmentalized system. Ulitin ko, ginagamit ang departmentalized system if the products consume different amount of resources in the department or in every department. And in that case, bawat producing department may kanya-kanyang overhead rate. As the products go through to that department, mag-a-assign tayo or mag-allocate tayo ng overhead sa product na yan on the basis of the overhead rate in that department. Okay? Next. If plant-wide system is used, item letter D tayo. Pag plant-wide tayo, calculate the per unit cost of each product if plant-wide is used. Pag plant-wide system tayo, isang overhead rate lang ang ating kakailanganin. Ito, sa letter C, ano? Compute the plant-wide rate based on VLRs. Ito ang ating plant-wide rate. Pag plant-wide system, isang overhead rate lang ang ating gagamitin. It applies to all products. Blanket rate yan, ibig sabihin yan. Ano? Sa plant-wide system, there is just one overhead rate that will be applied to all products. Kahit anong produkto yan. Yung rate na yan, yan ang gagamitin. And in our case, ang total overhead is 720,000. Total DLRs ay 180,000. Ito po yan, yung 180, ito class, o yan. 180. Ito naman yung total overhead. Kaya yung ating overhead rate is 4 pesos per DLR. So we compute the total cost. Prime cost, 160 and 1,000,005. Allocated overhead. The total DLRs ng deluxe ay 20,000. O di 20,000 times 4. Ganun lang kasimple yun. Then, 160,000 times 4 naman kay regular. Ito yan eh. Ito po class, oh. 20 and 160. Yan. So, the total overhead allocated to deluxe ay 80,000. For regular, 640. Total manufacturing cost, 240,000 and 2,140,000. Divided by the units, then you have the per unit cost. Yan. Yan po ang plant-wide system. Ngayon, pag activity-based costing tayo, ang ating cost pool, activity. Ang ibig sabihin nun, ang pooling natin or accumulation ng cost is per activity. We accumulate the cost of activity ng setup. We accumulate the cost ng activity na moving material. Accumulate the cost of machining. Accumulate the cost of inspection. And we determine the activity rate. The activity rate is just the same as the overhead rate. But more particularly, pag ABC, we call that activity rate or cost pool rate. In general, overhead rate din ang mga yun eh. So, 1, 2, 3, 4. Apat na cost pool pala ito pagdating sa ABC. Kasi apat na activity yan eh. So, apat na activity rate ang ating kukumputin. Set up ng equipment, 240. Material moves, 120. Machining, 200. Inspection, 160. Anong ating activities naman ay ito. DLRs, 180. Setups, 100. Machine hours, 90. Inspection, 18. Number of moves, 300. Ay, ang gagamitin naman natin dyan, ito eh. Sa setting equipment, setup. Sa moving material, number of material moves. For the machining, machine hours. For the inspection, inspection hours. Ito yung inspection hours. Ano? Yan. So, we compute the activity rate. Here are the activity rates, ladies and gentlemen. For setup, 2,400 per setup. For material moves, 400 per move. For machining, 2.22 per machine hour. For inspection, 8.89 per inspection hour. Compute na tayo ng total cost. Prime cost, 160 and 1,000,005. Then allocated factory overhead based dun sa activity rate na kinompute natin kanina. Ito pong setup cost. Ang total setup cost actually 240,000, ano? And the rate is 2,400 per setup. Refer to the activity ng setup, 60 and then 40. So 60 times 2,400 and 40 times 2,400. Ito po yun. 2,400 times 60, 144,000. 2,400 times 40, that's 96,000. Material moves naman, yan po. 400 per move. 180 and 120. So 180 times 400 for deluxe, 120 times 400 for regular. Sa machining, ito po, nakabase yan sa machine hours. I-multiply nyo lang po yung rate ng machining doon sa activity consumed by deluxe and regular respectively. And then, ganun din po sa inspection. So, the total cost of deluxe and regular ay 416,000 and then 1,964,000. Divide by units produced, ayan po, 20,200. The unit cost is 20.8 and 9.82. Yan po ang activity-based costing. Hindi mahirap ang ABC or activity-based costing class, ha? Marikititos nga lang kasi pag napakaraming activity, siyempre, marami tayong cost pool rate na kukomputin. Pag ayaw nyong i-compute yung cost pool rate, okay lang. I-allocate nyo directly using the consumption ratio. Halimbawa po, in the case of setup, ang consumption ratio ay ito. Tingnan nyo yung setup. Activity consumed ng product over the total activities. 60 over 100, that's 60%. 40 over 100, that's 40%. Ang tawag po doon ay consumption ratio. Consumption ratio times the setup cost, which is in this case is 240. 60% ng 240, 40% ng 240. Yun po yung kanina na na-compute ninyo na 144,000 and then 96,000. Yan po ang activity-based costing, plant-wide, and departmentalized system. Another problem for activity-based costing and for traditional na plant-wide system. Sa tatlo na yan, ladies and gentlemen, ang pinaka-accurate yung activity-based costing, syempre. Between traditional and ABC, the traditional method or the ABC gives cost allocation which is more accurate. Ang nangyayari sa traditional, may tinatawag na cross-subsidization. Later on, you will realize kung paano nagkakaroon ng cross-subsidy. Meantime, we answer this problem number 4 muna. Assume a traditional costing system applies. The total overhead is 160,000. And if we base that on DLRs, co-compute natin yung overhead rate based on DLRs. The total number of DLRs ay 650 and 150. What is the amount of overhead cost assigned to the standard model and to the deluxe model? Okay, so una, mag-compute tayo ng overhead rate. Plant-wide rate ito, ano? Tingnan nyo to. Factory overhead rate. The total overhead is 160,000. The total DLRs ay 800. So 160,000 over 800 DLRs, 200 per DLR. That's the overhead rate. So the allocated overhead is, it's very simple class. 650 times 200, that's for standard. And then 150 hours for deluxe times 200, that's 30,000. Ito po yung 160 kung paano na-allocate. Okay? Next, if we use activity-based costing. If we use activity-based costing, there are two cost pools here or two activities involved. Ito pong setup and then number of components. More likely than not, handling yan eh. Ano? Kasi pag maraming component parts ang product, marami ding handling cost na mangyayari. Kaya naka-base sa components, number of components. Ano? So, this is the overhead cost for setup, and this is the overhead cost for number of components. There are 10 setups, 3 and 7, standard and deluxe respectively. And there are 80 components, 30 and 50 respectively. So, gagawin ninyo dyan, pwede na natin i-allocate directly, ano? Kahit di na natin computein yung cost pool rate. Pero pwede naman pag gusto nyo. Halimbawa, for setup, 40,000 divided by 10, that's 4,000 per setup, ano? But we can also allocate that directly. Ang fraction ay 3/10, 7/10. So the setup cost allocated to excuse me, standard is 30%, 3/10 times 40,000, that's 12,000. Then 7/10 times 40,000, that's 28,000 for deluxe. For the number of components, 30 and 50, so that's 3/8, 5/8, times 120,000. So, ito po, 45,000 and 75,000 respectively. So, ang total overhead allocated kay standard, 57, kay deluxe, 103. Pansinin nyo kanina po, sa traditional, ang overhead allocated kay standard, 130. Sobra-sobra. Deluxe naman, 30. Kulang. Distorted yung cost. Ang tawag dyan, cross-subsidy. Product cost cross-subsidization. What does it mean by that? Distortion ng cost yun eh. Miscosting of one product resulting from miscosting of another product. Kumbaga, nag-cross ng landas yung cost. Pansinin ninyo, ano? Yung cost ng standard under traditional, that's overstated by as much as 73,000. Pansinin nyo, class. Standard 130, 57 ABC, traditional 130, ABC 57, yung total overhead under traditional for standard product is over cost ng 73,000. Ang mas accurate kasi dyan, 57,000 eh. Yan ang mas tama. Eh, paano ba naman kasi, halimbawa, in the case of setup, na ang driver ng setup cost ay syempre yung setup activity, eh inallocate ba naman natin sa DLRs? Na nakita ninyo naman, yung number of DLRs ng standard, 650 hours. Eh, yan ang dahilan, kaya napakaraming allocated overhead sa kanya eh. Which is inaccurate actually. So 73. Yung 73 na yan, na overcosting ng standard, it results to another miscosting. The deluxe product is understated by 73. You compare 30,000 and 103,000. 73. Undercost yung deluxe, under traditional. Kumbaga, yung kulang na cost sa deluxe, napunta doon kay standard. Now, what is the implication of that? Mali yung cost. Inaccurate yung cost. If you make decisions based on those information, based on this information, eh mali din yung magiging decision mo. For example, you are determining the selling price based on the cost. Ang labas niyan eh, mahal yung standard mo. Mahal yung cost per unit ng standard. Mataas din ang presyo mo. Yung pala, mas mahal dapat ang kwan. Mas mataas dapat ang cost ng deluxe. Nalulugi ka sa deluxe, di mo alam. Hindi ka tumutubo sa standard. Kala mo tumutubo ka. Kala mo tumutubo ka sa deluxe, yung pala lugi ka. Sa standard, akala mo nalulugi ka, yung pala mas profitable yon. that is distortion in the cost. We call that product cost cross-subsidy. In case tanungin, how much is the product cost cross-subsidy? Ang sagot, 73,000. Yung cost na lumipat sa ibang product, from one product to another product. And it happens in traditional costing or peanut butter costing. Nangyayari kasi dyan sa traditional, it is a peanut butter approach, peanut butter costing approach, wherein ini-spread mo yung overhead sa lahat ng products ng pare-pareho. It's like, nagpapalaman ka ng tinapay, ini-spread mo. Yan po ay peanut butter costing na tinatawag. Okay? Next, problem number 5. This is problem number 5. Ano? Yes, problem number 5 ito. Itong July plant. Okay. So that's problem number 5. Your board examination is fast approaching. Galingan nyo na lang sa board exam. Galingan nyo rin ang pre-board. Okay, we proceed sa problem number 5. And this is departmentalized system. Compute the predetermined overhead rate for each department if molding uses machine hours and assembly uses labor hours. And calculate the per unit overhead rate for each product if 80,000 units of A were produced and 90,000 units of B were produced. So sa molding, machine hours tayo. Sa assembly, direct labor hours. In molding, the total machine hours ay 20,000. In assembly, the total DLRs ay 50,000. The total overhead in molding is 360,000. In assembly, 750,000. So ito po yung ating overhead rate for molding. We have there 18. 360,000 over 20,000 machine hours. So the rate is 18 per machine hour. And for assembly, which is based on DLRs, 750,000 over 50,000 DLRs. That is 15 per DLR. 15 pesos. 18 pesos for molding. 15 pesos per assembly. I-allocate natin yung overhead. I-allocate natin yung overhead. Sa product A and B from molding department. Tingnan niyo yung product, ano? Molding department based on machine hours yan, 5 and 15. So rate ng overhead rate sa molding 18 times the machine hours, 5,000 times 18, 15,000 times 18. Then for assembly, 20,000 times 15, 30,000 times 15. Total overhead allocated. Divide by units produced. Then you have per unit overhead. 4.875 then 8 pesos. Yan po ang ating overhead allocation. Yun pong traditional and activity-based costing. And then, yung cross-subsidy, na nangyayari pagdating sa activity-based costing. Now, we proceed to the multiple choice, in particular, number 4, so that I can elaborate further on the peanut butter costing that will result to product cost cross-subsidization. Kanina, kinompute natin total product cost cross-subsidy. Ito sa number 4 naman, cross-subsidy per unit. Okay, compute tayo ha. Ulitin ko, ang activity-based costing, that is more accurate method. Sa traditional, nangyayari ang cost distortion. Nangyayari ang tinatawag na cost cross-subsidization. Product cost cross-subsidization. Miscosting of one product resulting to miscosting of another product. Kasi lumilipat yung cost. Namali yung isa, namali din yung isa. Kasi naglipat-lipat yung cost eh. Nag-cross ng landas, kumbaga eh. Mali yung allocation kasi eh. Yung total cost intact, walang problema. Pero, kung inallocate mo mali, siyempre, mali yung unit cost, mako-compute. Or inaccurate. Ito, we compare. Factory company makes two products, X and Z. X is being introduced this period, whereas Z has been in production for 2 years. For the period about to begin, 1,000 units of each product are to be manufactured. And assume that the only overhead item is the cost of engineering change orders. And there are 8 change orders for X, 2 change orders for Z, and 2 machine hours per unit of X, 3 machine hours per unit of Z, and that the cost of a change order is 600. So, one change order, it will cost 600. So, in this case, because there are 10 engineering change orders, the total overhead, the total engineering change order cost is 6,000. So, pag traditional system na i-base natin sa machine hour, ito po yung ating overhead rate. 600 times 10, yun yung total overhead, 6,000. Over the total machine hours. 1,000 yung number of units per product, At 2 and 3 machine hours yung number of hours per unit. So total machine hours will be 1,000 times 2 plus 1,000 times 3 or 5,000. So 6,000 over 5,000, the overhead rate under traditional system is 1.2. 1.2 per machine hour. Yan. Therefore, ang ating overhead allocated to product X, 2,000 hours yung product X 2,000 times 1.2. Kaya, ang per unit overhead ng X is 2,400 over 1,000. That's 2.4. Or simply, dahil 2 machine hours ang per unit of X, tapos 1.2 per machine hour yung rate, o di 2 times 1.2, 2.4. Yan yun, At sa product Z naman, 3 machine hours times 1.2 per machine hour, 3.6 per machine hour. Ngayon, if we apply activity-based costing and we allocate the engineering change order cost, the overhead cost, using the activity, which is change orders, engineering change orders, ito po ang ating magiging allocation. Identifiable naman Si X, mayroong 8 change orders. Each change order will cost 600. 8 times 600, the total overhead to X is 4,800. And there are 1,000 units of X. So the per unit overhead for product X is 4.8. And for product Z, 2 change orders, 2 times 600, that's 1,200 over 1,000. That's 1.2. You compare now, ladies and gentlemen. You compare the per unit overhead. For product X, under traditional, we have computed 2.4. Under activity-based costing, it's 4.8. The difference is 2.4. Alin ang mas tama dyan? Mas accurate? Ay yung 4.8. Aba, si product X pala, under traditional is under cost by 2.4. Eh si product Z, under traditional, 3.6. Under ABC, 1.2. Ang mas accurate dyan? Siyempre, yung 1.2, aba, si product Z pala, under traditional, is over cost by 2.4. You see that the undercosting in X resulted to overcosting of Z. Lumipat yung cost from X to Z. So the cost subsidy per unit is 2.4. Do you compare this? 4.8 and 2.4. Yan yung undercosting ng X. Compare this, 3.6 and 1.2. Yan yung overcosting ng Z. 2.4. Cross-subsidy per unit. Yan ang tinatawag na cross-subsidy per unit. Okay? Yan. So, yung mga iba dyan, class, ay madali namang sagutin yan, ano? And, I'm leaving it to all of you. You can access this answered copy, of course, from the staff. You can obtain the material from the staff. Yan. Ito ang isang i-explain ko pa. Ito pong 10, 11, and 12. In particular, yung 12. Ito po. Kayo ay magtaka kung paano na-compute yan. Total, katatapos natin ng just-in-time eh. Natapos natin ng just-in-time manufacturing system. So we take up 10, 11, and 12. And item number 10 is traditional system. And the overhead is assigned on the basis of the machine hours, ano? Ito. Under the current system, the overhead cost is assigned on the basis of machine hours. That's plant-wide system, ano? Ito po yung ating total overhead. 250,000 for machining, 300,000 for material moves, then 450,000 for setup. Or a total na 1 million na factory overhead. So if we apply the overhead on the basis of the machine hours, blue and white has 50,000 machine hours, contemporary has 12,500. Our rate is 16 per machine hour. 1 million over 62,500. Kaya pag inallocate natin yan, ang allocated overhead kay blue and white, o di syempre yung yung ating 50,000 times 16. O, computein natin yung unit cost. Blue and white has prime cost na 700 plus allocated overhead. Diba, ang rate ng overhead, ito, 16 per machine hour. Then there are 50,000 machine hours for blue and white. 50,000 times 16, that is actually 800,000. Ano? The total manufacturing cost for blue and white is 1,500,000. Prime cost na 700. And then 800,000 na overhead. So the unit cost is 750. For the contemporary, na may prime cost na 150, ang allocated overhead niya is 12.5 times 16, or that's 200,000. So 200,000 yan actually, ano? 200,000. 200,000 allocated overhead to contemporary. So total manufacturing cost for the contemporary is 350. Divided by 50,000, yan, 7 pesos per unit po. Yan po ay kung ang ginamit natin traditional. Okay? Next. If we use activity-based costing, tatlong klase ng activity ang involved dito. The overhead is made up of 3 cost pools. Maintenance rather, driven by machine hours. Materials handling, driven by material moves. Then setup cost, as driven by setup. We shall compute 3 cost pool rates or 3 activity rates. We have illustrated that kanina. Or we may allocate the overhead directly based on the consumption ratio. Whichever method you use. Pero di naman ang lalabas dyan eh. Anyway, here are the cost pool rates, ladies and gentlemen. For maintenance, the rate is 4 per machine hour. For materials handling, the rate is 0.375 per move. And for setup, the rate is 3,000 per setup. So you compute the overhead allocated to blue and white and contemporary, respectively, by multiplying the cost pool rates or activity rates by the activity consumed. Halimbawa, kay blue and white, 50,000 machine hours times 4. Yan yung allocated maintenance cost. 700,000 times 0.375 na material moves. Handling. Yan yung allocated handling cost kay blue and white. Then 100 times 3,000, yan yung allocated setup cost sa kanya. The total overhead allocated to blue and white is 762,500. And for contemporary, ayan po, 237,500. Ang unit cost natin ngayon, ayan, prime cost plus allocated overhead divided by units. 731 for blue and white, and then 775 for contemporary. Yan po ang activity-based costing. Next, number 12. Ito talagang i-explain ko eh. Kasi yung ABC, maraming beses na nating na-illustrate kanina doon sa mga problems. Ito talagang gusto kong i-explain eh. Yung pag-allocate ng overhead under just-in-time manufacturing. Anyway, kahapon, tinake up naman natin just-in-time. Okay, makinig kayo. Pag traditional, the layout of plant or of the equipment is more of a process-oriented. You have seen yesterday in process costing that, especially in sequential processing, there is Department 1, Department 2, Department 3. Department 1 has equipment, of course, has machines to run the process. Same is true with Department 2, Department 3. the products will go through to all of these departments. Si product ay halimbawa, dadaan kay Department 1, dadaan kay Department 2, dadaan kay Department 3. Ang layout kasi dyan ng equipment is process-oriented layout eh. Kung ma-imagine niyo, there will be many movements of the materials and the partially completed products. You move from storage to Department 1. You move from Department 1 to Department 2. You move from Department 2 to Department 3. You move from Department 3 to Finished Goods Department. And you know, there is a cost to move these units. There is handling cost for all of this. Hindi ba pwedeng mag-produce tayo na wala nang movement ang mga yan? Di transfer ng transfer ng transfer ng transfer? Alam niyo, tumatagal din ang proseso. Pag transfer ng transfer ng transfer ng transfer ng transfer. Hindi ba pwedeng sa isang department matapos na doon ang proseso, matapos na yung isang product? Can we not devote equipment for one particular product? All the process will be complete in that one department. Basically, in just-in-time manufacturing, that is the approach. I mean, the layout of the equipment or of the machine is product-oriented layout. As in, we organize the manufacturing plant by product line. So this is product A, product B. In this product A department, nandyan na lahat ng kakailanganin. Tatapusin na yan sa area na yan. Etong product B, tatapusin na yan. Sa just-in-time, may tinatawag na manufacturing cells or manufacturing cell. Ano? Factory within a factory. It's a mini factory. So, in a plant, manufacturing plant, it's like there are mini factories. Ang labas, many factories din. Kasi maraming, sa loob ng planta, may manufacturing cell, si product A. May manufacturing cell, si product B. May manufacturing cell, si product C. Matatapos na yung doon, production. Hindi na transfer ng transfer. Eh ngayon, ano ba ang relevance nito sa pinag-uusapan natin? Ang pinag-uusapan natin, allocation ng factory overhead eh. Magaling na tanong. Ganito eh. Yung overhead, pag traditional, allocate na tayo ng allocate eh. Imagine nyo yung kanina, kung 3 departments yan, isang product dadaan sa 3 departments. Bawat department may overhead allocation. 1, 2, 3. Allocate na tayo ng allocate dyan. Ay kung 10 products yan, nadadaan sa 3 departments, 3 times 10, 30 na allocation ang gagawin mo. Ang problema mo, baka mali pa yung allocation mo, inaccurate yung cost, madi-distort. Pero in the case of just-in-time manufacturing, na bawat product ay may separate na manufacturing cell, abay de syempre yung overhead na problema nating i-allocate, hindi na natin i-allocate ngayon sapagkat direct cost na doon. Eh kung isang manufacturing cell, isang product lang naman ang pinuproduce doon, eh de syempre lahat ng cost na na-incur doon para lang sa kanya. Look at this item number 12. In the blue and white manufacturing cell, 210,000 yung maintenance cost na na-incur doon, 260,000 yung handling, 300,000 yung setup. O, adi sa kanya lahat yon, identifiable na eh. Hindi na tayo mag-allocate. Kasi bawat manufacturing cell, mayroong cost na na-incur doon, identifiable na. So, 770 at saka 230,000. Yan ang overhead. O di, i-add nyo na lang yan, ladies and gentlemen, doon sa prime cost to determine the unit cost. For example, in the case of blue and white, which has 700,000 prime cost, 700,000 plus 770,000 divided by 200,000 units. O, yan po yung 735 na unit cost. At yun sa contemporary, na may 150,000 na prime cost plus 230,000 na overhead divided by 50,000 units, ayan po, yung 7.6 na 7.6 na cost per unit. Okay? So, yan po ang tungkol sa activity-based costing, just-in-time, traditional, plant-wide, and departmentalized system. But we will have more of departmentalized system doon sa allocation ng support department cost. Yan. So, this materials, nandiyan na po yung sagot, nandiyan din yung solution sa mga iba, no? Yung mga iba naman na hindi naman difficult na problem, simple problem or easy ang category, hindi ko na nilagay, yung key answer na lang. Just obtain the answered handout from the staff, and we will have a break, and our next will be same, Afar 18. Afar 18 part 2 is tungkol sa allocation of service department cost or allocation of support department cost. Okay? Sige, thank you sa inyong pakikinig. Our next topic will be allocation of service department cost after the break time.